like you to expand on this topic about interaction with APIs for different benefits, and then really wanted to talk about, especially for EHR.
Absolutely. I think Aditya gave me a great foundation to kind of expand into that area of EHRs specifically. Excuse me in advance for being very US focused. That's kind of what I know best. So I'll kind of talk from that experience. But I think Aditya's example is a very good one that kind of exposes the advantage of FHIR in the EHR space over what previously existed. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with HL7 or CCD, CCDA documents, data types that are shared at scale at very high volume between large institutions, but are difficult to parse, difficult to analyze, difficult for small applications to be able to render into a UI or make useful for individual patients. So what we've seen in the US over the last, I would say, 10 years or so is a push by different regulatory bodies to move from these older standards. Aditya mentioned X12 as well. That's kind of the standard for healthcare transactions in the US. It's actually enshrined in law, but it's a standard that predates the internet even. And so it's very burdensome for institutions that are not these massive, that don't manage these massive IT systems to handle this data and make it useful and get the most out of it. What we've seen in terms of that regulatory push is requiring electronic health records systems to be able to share data via FHIR, which is a more standardized format than HL7. If you've worked with HL7 integrations, you'll know that implementations of HL7 can vary widely when you're trying to integrate data from another system into your own. In HL7, there can be a lot of different issues. There's a lot of different versions, and some people candidly don't adhere to the spec completely. So it can be a very difficult data standard to work with. Whereas with FHIR, what we're now seeing with requirements from the federal government in the United States is a push towards FHIR because it allows for a much simpler integration path than previous standards. REST is a architectural approach that simplifies the process for transmitting data. Obviously, it encompasses all the information that one needs from the record inside the record itself. You don't need any previously existing knowledge to take that record and integrate it. And it's a much simpler integration timeline, much faster integration timeline than previous integration approaches. So that's what we've tried to leverage at OneUp Health, and many other companies are doing as well. Everyone in the industry, the lifeblood of the healthcare industry, right, is data and usable data beyond that, right? Data that's usable and usable at the point that it's needed. Previously, a lot of older standards required batching. You get data the next day, maybe the next week, sometimes months later. But data is valuable, most valuable right at the point of care, right? So what these regulatory pushes and industry shifts at the same time have facilitated is an ability to get closer to real-time data that's easier to integrate and easier to create new connections between different stakeholders, whether that's between payers and providers, between providers and secondary or tertiary providers, or analytics firms that want to do broad analytics across populations. FHIR allows those connections to be stood up quickly, allows the data to be integrated and analyzed quickly, and insights to be returned back to the provider right at the point of care, which is what we're starting to see with those using our platform and with others in the industry who are leveraging FHIR. So just to give kind of a more specific example of that, today we're leveraging the open FHIR APIs that Epic, for example, is using. That's the biggest EHR company in the US. we're leveraging that data and the FHIR APIs that they are required by law to stand up to pull data and feed it into clinical trial programs for specific pharmaceutical programs that are looking at drugs that are treatments for heart disease, for example. Previously, that was a process for those studies that took months to set up, months to pull the data, and then some other extensive amount of time to transform that data from X12 or CCDA, some XML format, into a relational format where it can be more easily analyzed. Today, that technical timeline for the technical components of the implementation is something that takes on the order of a couple of weeks. Legal agreements can cause some variability there, but regardless, the increased velocity in terms of integrating and then the ease of use with that data, we're already seeing the benefits of that in that context, as well as in the context of value-based care arrangements, which are kind of our attempt in the US to pivot from a pure transactional fee-for-service model to something that's more based on the quality of care that's delivered and the overall health of the individual. And with that type of reimbursement model for providers, you need a lot more data, you need it more timely, and you need to be able to assess the population level health of your patient cohort that is under your care as a provider organization. With the standard itself, with the requirement that EHRs expose their data via this standard without undue burden to outside organizations that have a right to that data, we see a much more frictionless process between provider systems and payer organizations who are reimbursing for care than we did previously. And so that's kind of the advantage that we're seeing in the most immediate term is a huge reduction in friction that allows for these new kinds of treatment and reimbursement models that ultimately we're showing a reduction of costs, around 2 to 3%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about an industry in the United States that's $4 trillion, 2 to 3% is a huge amount of money over the previous models. So that's I think a good example of the kind of advantages we're seeing with open FHIR APIs from the EHR vendors that control so much of this patient data. One other example that we're seeing that I wanted to highlight is medical errors. That's one that we hear about a lot. So someone doesn't have the right information at the right time to say, oh, this person has a previous prescription. They've come into the emergency room with a particular issue. They don't have the information on what that person's prescription drug history is. So they administer a drug that they don't know is going to have an adverse interaction with an existing drug in their system. What we're seeing now with FHIR assisting in integrating data from external systems is that a EHR can receive data through FHIR as well as the Smart on FHIR app framework that allows for easy app development on top of EHRs. We're seeing the ability to push data from external systems to the EHR to the provider's screen at the point of care, allow them to recognize things like an adverse reaction to a particular drug, or overall just a patient's medical history, not just at that provider system, but at others, and that allows them to inform their care and provide more accurate and appropriate care for that individual in the moment, rather than waiting hours, potentially days for data from systems through health and information exchanges, older ways of integrating that have a latency that FHIR does not have. So those are a couple examples that we're taking advantage of along with some of our partners at the moment.